In this episode, we will pick up where we left off last episode, assessing Mark Halperin's contention that Bernie Sanders was the rightful winner of the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries and only lost both races due to efforts by the Democratic establishment and the DNC to put their thumbs on the scale, perhaps rig or at least create unfair hurdles for Sanders to overcome. I will link the video I did on the 2016 race in the description. In that video, as well as this one, I depart from my normal format of thoroughly assessing the presidential elections, as I have done throughout my presidential election series. I will link those videos in the descriptions of all the videos I did in the earlier presidential elections as well, because I think it helps to see those videos to study how other primaries played out and how these two primary battles compare to earlier ones. So the case that Mark Halperin and others that agree with him make regarding what the DNC and the greater Democratic establishment did to derail Sanders is a little bit different when we look at the 2020 race compared to what we looked at in 2016 in our last video. So here with 2020, we're going to be looking at these questions. Did the DNC and the larger Democratic establishment pressure certain presidential candidates to either stay in or exit the race to make it more difficult for Bernie Sanders to win the nomination? And if yes, if they did do that, did this particular thing rob Bernie Sanders of the nomination? Was this unfair and undemocratic? And had these measures not been taken, would Sanders have had the necessary support to win the Democratic nomination? And so those will be the things that we'll be exploring. And as with the earlier video, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the election analysis, but I am going to touch on these other subjects a little bit as well. The Democratic field was large in 2020, to say the least. It consisted of many candidates who could have been considered credible, including the 9 pictured here, who probably did the best out of the bunch. But even amongst the ones not pictured here, there were people with very impressive resumes: senators, governors, members of the House, former senators, governors, members of the House. There were businessmen, mayors, former mayors. So a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds. And all these candidates were hoping for a chance to take on Donald Trump, who they seemed to think was vulnerable. Now, amongst the candidates here was Elizabeth Warren. Now, if you think in terms of left-right spectrum issues, ideology, she was probably closest to Bernie Sanders. And, if for voters who do vote in terms of issues and ideology, they might have found both of those candidates appealing. And perhaps if Warren wasn't in the race, some of those voters might have gone with Sanders or vice versa. But there were also candidates like Andrew Yang, Pete Buttigieg, and Tulsi Gabbard, who might also have been appealing to a lot of Bernie Sanders voters. Bernie Sanders had a lot of young people who supported him, and many young people might have found some of these other candidates appealing as well. And there may have been a lot of former Clinton supporters who might have found somebody like Elizabeth Warren appealing, even though she was further left than Clinton. And former Clinton voters also might have found Amy Klobuchar, Michael Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, or Joe Biden appealing, depending on really what those priorities were. So I'm going to kind of be talking a little bit more about that. Who were these different candidates? What was their appeal? What kind of voters supported them? And how did they kind of measure to voters who might have supported Clinton in the past or voters who might have supported Bernie Sanders in the last election? In our last video, we talked about different voting blocks in the Democratic Party and which ones tended to support Hillary Clinton and which ones tended to support Bernie Sanders. Now, Sanders is back in the race this time, but would he be able to hold on to the support of the people who voted for him last time with all these other candidates in the races? Now, he had a lot of support amongst young people in 2016. Now those young people were 4 years older. There's a big difference between being 21 and being 25. When you're 21, maybe you're in college, maybe you're surrounded by other college students, maybe more radical college students, maybe they're pulling you in that more radical direction. Now you're 25, you're out of college, you're trying to settle down, start a career. Maybe you've already started your career, maybe you're thinking of having a family. Your priorities are going to be a little bit different. Are your voting patterns going to be the same? And what about those people that supported Bernie Sanders that maybe were in their mid-20s 4 years earlier? Now they're in their late 20s. Are they still going to be voting the same way? So I think that that's an interesting question to ask. And what about all those former Hillary Clinton voters. We talked about how Hillary Clinton did get more votes than Bernie Sanders last time. So for him to win, maybe he's got to appeal to some of those voters, or maybe some of those voters are going to be splitting amongst some of these other candidates. So that's what we're going to kind of look at as we proceed and we examine this race here in 2020. So let's take a look at some polls, and I was able to find some Real Clear Politics polling averages for both December 15th and January 15th. And let me explain what these polling averages are. Basically, what Real Clear Politics does is it takes numerous respected pollsters and averages all their numbers together. So what we're looking at here is not one poll, but the average of numerous of the most respected polls that were out around these particular points in time, December 15th and January 15th. Now, the voting is going to start in February, so this is pretty much right before the voting is to start, and we see Joe Biden with a lead in both December and January. In fact, we don't see a ton of difference between December and January, not much change in that month. Now, Joe Biden had been the former vice president. He was pretty well liked, a pretty popular vice president, although he did not have a commanding lead. He wasn't a clear front runner, as there were some people that were concerned about his age. So a lot of these other candidates had their share of support as well. So it was a pretty cluttered field. As you can see, Bernie Sanders is trying to regain the momentum that he had in 2016, and he's got a lot of support continuing to go with him, as he's got second place here in both December and January, with Elizabeth Warren in third place. Pete Buttigieg is going to be the breakout star a bit with fourth place. Now, Pete was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. It's not too common that you'll see a mayor of South Bend become a top presidential candidate, but we see him here polling much higher than many other senators, governors, etc. So he was able to create some buzz about him with a pretty strong campaign, and we see Michael Bloomberg in the January poll. Now, and in the December poll as well. Now, what Bloomberg is going to do, he's going to enter the race late. He's going to do what the likes of Steve Forbes, Fred Thompson, and Wesley Clark tried to do. They kind of enter late after a lot of the other candidates had been beating each other up. They're the fresh face. So he's going to try to do that. And a lot of times those candidates will start with some strong buzz, but won't always necessarily win. So we'll see what Michael Bloomberg does here. He's going to skip some of those early contests, so he won't be competing in Iowa or New Hampshire, but he's going to hope to do well on Super Tuesday. And we're going to see, rounding out the list, the likes of Andrew Yang, Cory Booker, Tulsi Gabbard, and Tom Steyer, all trying to kind of break out as they're there, kind of mired in the lower single digits. The Iowa caucus is going to happen on February 3rd, and the results here are not exactly in line with the national polling averages that we looked at in the prior slides, as Bernie Sanders is going to get the most votes in Iowa. Pete Buttigieg is going to be closely behind him, although later on it will be determined that Buttigieg actually won more delegates in Iowa than Sanders. And the reason why that happened, it has to do with the way the Iowa caucus works. Basically, the Iowa caucuses are a series of local meetings that happen where different members of the Democratic Party meet, discuss the different candidates, and then have public votes. And what happens at those meetings is any candidate that doesn't get at least 15% of the vote, what happens is those voters are then asked to support a different candidate. It's kind of like a runoff, or maybe even similar to a ranked choice voting kind of thing. So what happens is a lot of those candidates that are below that 15% threshold end up not getting the support statewide because they lose those voters, and those voters get divvied up amongst the other candidates. And what seems to have happened is Bernie Sanders got more of the first vote totals, but then as the second choices were made by these people who had originally supported these lesser candidates, a lot of those second choices went with Buttigieg and not with Sanders. Nevertheless, the media largely reported it as a Sanders win, or in some cases, a tie with Buttigieg. Elizabeth Warren would end up getting third place, and Joe Biden, who had been in the national lead, as we saw in those earlier polls, he only got fourth in Iowa. New Hampshire followed the next week, and like Iowa, Sanders and Buttigieg were neck and neck. So New Hampshire happens February 11th. Sanders is going to get more votes in New Hampshire, but the delegates are going to be tied. Now, Amy Klobuchar is going to get a very respectable third place, a good showing for her as it was higher than her national polling numbers. And she had some strong debate performances where she demonstrated strong knowledge of domestic issues and different issues that were going on in Congress, different legislation. So I really think she impressed many people, and it showed by her better than expected results here in the New Hampshire primary. Elizabeth Warren, who is from neighboring Massachusetts, she could only muster fourth place and she got no delegates. And Biden came in fifth despite that national polling lead that we saw earlier. And he had that lead for several months before, but he was only able to get fifth place in New Hampshire. So the Sanders is going to get this win here, but his vote total is going to be lower than it was in 2016. So not all the people that supported Sanders in 2016 are going to continue to support him here. Some of those voters are going to be going towards some of these other candidates. In fact, his vote total was about half of what it had been in 2016 when he was going up against Hillary Clinton. So apparently some of these other candidates were able to win over many of those voters. He had about 75,000 less votes this time than he did last time, and those folks had drifted away towards other candidates. So the vote totals for Elizabeth Warren, Andrew Yang, and Tulsi Gabbard combined did not add up to 75,000. So I suspect some percentage of this 2016 Sanders vote might very well have gone to Buttigieg. And if Buttigieg wasn't in the race, perhaps many of those voters would have gone back to Bernie Sanders. So the reason why I bring this up is I think that there's a thought out there that Mark Halperin and others have, is that all these Buttigieg voters would have gone to Joe Biden had Buttigieg not been in the race. But as I look at these numbers here, I suspect that at least a portion of those Buttigieg voters would have gone to Sanders, as I suspect that a lot of them had been Sanders supporters before. So with those two wins in Iowa and New Hampshire, Sanders is on a roll, and we'll look at to see if he got a bounce from those wins. And with all the different election videos we have done, I've tried to evaluate how big these bounces are from early state showings. And I think the conclusion I've made in the past is that, yes, there is some bounce that happens from, strong showings and wins in Iowa and New Hampshire, although only to a point. I think it's a misconception that these bounces are larger maybe than they actually are. But if we look at these new polling averages, now we're looking at mid-February. So in the earlier slide, we looked at polling averages from mid-December, mid-January. Now we're looking at mid-February. And it does indeed seem to have been some bounce here for Bernie Sanders. He has taken the lead and is now in first place for the first time. Now, he had not been in first place up until this point, but with these strong showings in both Iowa and New Hampshire, now he has taken the polling lead. And Joe Biden, who had been in first for most of the time leading up to this, has now moved down in second. But even though he had rather bad numbers in both Iowa and New Hampshire, he still continues to have at least respectable support nationwide and has only moved down to second place despite being in fourth and fifth in Iowa and New Hampshire respectively. Michael Bloomberg, who sat out both Iowa and New Hampshire, is now in third place. So he's neck and neck with Biden, only 1 point behind him. Now, Warren is in fourth place. Now, we mentioned Warren having a rather disappointing showing. She was only fourth in New Hampshire, so she's still fourth nationally. And Buttigieg, who was tied or in second place, depending on how you look at it. Maybe you look at it as first place in Iowa. Well, whatever the case may be, in these national numbers, he is still in what is it, fifth place behind all these other candidates. So he has not benefited from a really strong bounce for that respectable showing. So he's, still kind of behind. And in order for him to win the nomination, he's going to have to do a lot better than 10%. Similarly, with Amy Klobuchar, she had a pretty respectable showing in New Hampshire. She won a lot of respect and admiration from many people, but she's still sixth place in the national polling, and that's just not going to be good enough to win the nomination. On February 22nd, Nevada is going to have their vote, and Sanders is going to come in first again. So that's going to be 3 in a row. And this time he's winning Nevada, a state that he did not win in 2016. Hillary Clinton had won it, but Bernie Sanders is going to win it this time. So his momentum continues. And it's going to be Joe Biden coming in second, a showing that's going to allow Biden to start to make a comeback, maybe to reassure some of those people that were concerned about his weak showings in Iowa and New Hampshire. So he'll regain some momentum with a respectable second place showing here. And Buttigieg is going to continue to perform a little bit better than his national polling numbers. He's going to come in third in Nevada. Warren is going to come in fourth, and Amy Klobuchar is going to come in fifth. So Sanders' vote totals in Nevada here are going to be less actually than what he got in 2016 when he didn't win, but he's going to win this time because there's so many different candidates in the race splitting the non-Sanders vote. So with the 2016 race, the concern was that Bernie Sanders was denied that bounce from being able to win Iowa because Mark Halperin and others believe he was cheated out of Iowa, and perhaps that Iowa bounce might have helped him win Nevada. So the speculation was if he had won all three, maybe he could have gotten momentum to have done well in later races. Now in 2020, we're going to see him win all three of those early contests. So we'll be able to see kind of how that bounce works and if indeed Bernie Sanders is going to perform better this time with those three wins in a row. Now, according to this polling average here on February 28th, it does look like Sanders does seem to have a bit of a bounce. He's got 30% of the vote, a pretty sizable lead ahead of Biden, who's still in second at 18%. And then Bloomberg continues to be in third with 16%, Warren fourth with 12%, Buttigieg with 11%, Klobuchar with 5%, and then Steyer and Gabbard behind them. So we're going to see what happens here as we enter into this next phase in the race. Now, remember in 2016, when it went to South Carolina, Bernie Sanders really struggled there as he struggled in much of the South. So let's see how he does in 2020 in South Carolina and other later states. So Klobuchar is going to be continuing to slip here, and it would seem at this stage of the race when candidates start to reevaluate their chances and think about, okay, do they want to continue? If a candidate is polling at 5% and performing a little bit low in some of these states, a lot of times they do indeed drop out. Concerns about COVID are going to start to get very real at this time. The pandemic had a very negative effect on numerous European countries, causing overcrowding of many hospitals and many deaths. So this was around the time the first cases are going to start to hit the U.S., and tremendous fear and panic are going to hit the nation. So how is this going to affect the primaries? Perhaps there were some voters who might otherwise have wanted to support a maverick, an anti-establishment candidate a candidate that might shake things up. But now they might think twice about that. Maybe now that's going to give pause to that impulse to vote for that maverick candidate. Perhaps now they might decide that this might not be the year to do that and instead vote for a more experienced insider, perhaps, to run the country. South Carolina is going to have their primary on Leap Day, February 29th, and voter turnout in South Carolina is actually going to be much higher than it had been in 2016, and Bernie Sanders is going to get more votes in 2020 despite all these candidates being in the race. So it does seem as though he gets something of a bounce from his wins in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, but only a slight bounce. As I said, his total votes was higher than in 2016, although his percentage was a bit bit lower, but he's still going to lose. Now, remember in 2016, the percentage difference was much higher between him and Hillary Clinton. So it's somewhat narrower here, but still a pretty big deficit. Biden is going to beat Sanders by 29 points, and that's going to give Biden a pretty big bounce indeed. As we look at the other candidates, Tom Steyer gets third place. Tom Steyer really made a play. He was trying to put a dent in South Carolina and maybe gain some momentum. He had rather low national numbers. The 11% may be a little bit better than his national numbers, but not good enough to really give him the momentum that he needed. And we're going to see Buttigieg, Warren, Klobuchar down into single digits as they're going to all struggle in the South, and that's going to make a big impression on their overall national vote totals. So the aftermath of the South Carolina primary, things are going to really shake up here. The night of the primary, as the results are coming in, Tom Steyer is going to drop out, as he was really hoping for some better numbers from the South Carolina primary than what he got. So he's going to drop out that night. And then the next day on March 1st, Pete Buttigieg is going to drop out. And then the day after that, March 2nd, Amy Klobuchar is going to drop out. Now, Super Tuesday is going to happen March 3rd, and Elizabeth Warren and Michael Bloomberg are still going to be in the race. Now, Mark Halperin and others are going to contend that the timing of the dropouts of Buttigieg and Klobuchar, that they were suspicious, and that it was further suspicious that Warren did not drop out. Her votes, Warren's votes, in the first 4 states were less than Buttigieg, although her national polling numbers were slightly better. Now, if it's true that Elizabeth Warren's voters would have gone to Sanders if she were to drop out, and that the voters of Buttigieg and Klobuchar would go to Biden, then this scenario benefits Biden, with Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropping out. If indeed those voters are going to go to Biden, he benefits. And if Warren's voters would have gone to Sanders, but if she stays in, then Biden benefits even more. And Halperin and others are going to suggest that this particular scenario was the best case scenario for Biden, suspiciously so, and that there may have been some shenanigans to make this all play out this way. So did Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar drop out earlier than they otherwise would have, purposely to derail Sanders? Did Elizabeth Warren stay in longer than she otherwise would have, purposely to derail Sanders? And did the DNC and the larger Democratic establishment play a part in those decisions? Now, I would say in all primaries that happen each time, there are going to be conversations about those middle tier candidates as their chances get smaller, and there's a perception that if they drop out, it can be better for the party or better for a particular candidate. I can remember Pat Buchanan visiting Richard Nixon's house in 1992, and Nixon is said to have tried to convince Buchanan to drop out of the race that year for the good of the party. So this kind of thing, party establishment, party insiders trying to convince a sort of maverick candidate to drop out, that does seem to happen at other instances. And although Buchanan had been close to Nixon and he respected him in this particular occasion, he did not listen to him and he did not drop out after that discussion. But there's often these pressures, as these long shot and middle tier candidates are often pressured to drop out. And I imagine that there might occasionally be pressure for some of these candidates to stay in, depending on what types of voters they appeal to. And if that pressure was put on any of these candidates, what was the nature of that pressure? Was it real arm twisting or more mild peer pressure? What were those conversations like? And if it was just mere suggestion, hey, maybe you should do this, is that really that bad of a thing? Is that really an unethical thing? Or was it something more akin to blackmail? Or was it more akin to bribery? Was there promises made? Perhaps a promise of the chance to be Secretary of Transportation. Now, Mark Halperin would suggest that Buttigieg and Klobuchar had a real shot of winning at this point. Now, looking at those numbers, looking at those polling numbers, looking at those results in South Carolina in particular, I certainly don't think it's true that Amy Klobuchar had much of a chance. And I think that her decision and the timing of her decision to drop out is pretty consistent of other candidates who had maybe respectable but not great performances in these early states. It's a little bit more debatable about Buttigieg, as he had a little bit better results in those early states than Klobuchar, but Nevertheless, if hypothetically he was promised that spot to be Secretary of Transportation if indeed he dropped out, now if he thought he really had a shot to be president, would the chance to be Secretary of Transportation really be enough of a carrot to cause him to drop out? Would that be enough of an incentive? I tend to think probably not. But let's say worst case scenario that he was promised that cabinet post. Is that necessarily wrong, or is that just part of politics? But let's take a look at some earlier nomination battles, and let's see if we can get a sense of what the normal time to drop out is, and whether or not these decisions by Klobuchar, Buttigieg, and Warren really, countered, the sort of normal trends that we normally see, those normal rules of thumb. So pictured on the left, we have Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren. Obviously, Buttigieg and Klobuchar decided to drop out. Elizabeth Warren decided to stay in. But oftentimes in these primaries and caucuses, we see candidates on the bubble of whether they drop out or not. Some of them stay in a little bit longer. Some of them drop out a little bit earlier than one might expect. If we look at Dick Gephardt in 1988, he won Iowa outright, so he had a pretty good showing there certainly, and then came in second in New Hampshire, but actually dropped out shortly thereafter as his poll numbers in the later states just weren't that good and his fundraising wasn't that good. So there was an example of somebody who definitely did better than Klobuchar that year and arguably did almost as good or as good as Buttigieg, but he dropped out nonetheless. And Bob Kerrey in 1992 won the South Dakota primary and was third in New Hampshire, so better again than Klobuchar, and you could argue as good or almost as good as Buttigieg, but he decided to drop out before Super Tuesday, as there were a couple of states in between South Dakota and Super Tuesday where he underperformed. And again, his fundraising and his polling numbers kind of dropped, as did Buttigieg and Klobuchar, so he decided to drop out. Now, in the case of Elizabeth Warren, we see somebody who was running in 2000, didn't even get to the primaries, but she was polling around second or third place, so it was respectable. Everybody thought that she had a pretty decent shot, but she dropped out kind of early, not willing to give it more time to kind of, get any better than the second or third place showings that she was getting in the polls. But it seemed like she had a decent shot at the timing that she dropped out. So, we see other cases where candidates who seem to be doing at least respectably, who maybe have a shot at winning, do drop out if they don't think they have an overwhelming shot. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we see candidates stay in a little bit later than maybe they otherwise would, when it seems as though they don't really have a particularly good shot, but they stay in nonetheless. And then also in 1992, we see that example with Jerry Brown, where he stayed in till the very end, despite having poor showings in the early states and at best mediocre showings in some of the states. I think he won a handful of primaries, but really did not seem to have a viable chance at any point, but he stayed in nonetheless. And the other example we see is John Kasich. Not the first time he ran, but the second time he ran in 2016. He really stayed in till pretty late in the process, despite doing poorly in many of the early states. So it kind of works both ways. Throughout history, we see some candidates dropping out a little bit earlier than normal, some a little bit later than normal. So there is no real rule of thumb. And I think the three candidates here were all kind of on the bubble. Two of them decided to drop out, even though they had, decent showings in some of those early states. And we had a third candidate decide to stay in, maybe despite mediocre showings, but maybe a little bit better polling numbers. So Elizabeth Warren stays in, the other two drop out. I don't think it really was that unusual from a historical perspective, and I think Halpern makes a bigger deal out of this than I think need be. So going into Super Tuesday, there's going to be 5 candidates in the race, although Tulsi Gabbard was not showing all that much strength, kind of only nominal support. So there were 4 candidates with at least double-digit polling numbers. And in terms of issues, traditional left-right spectrum, we can say that Warren and Sanders were close to each other and potentially might have been going after the same voters. And it is possible that her presence in the race could have hurt Sanders in some Super Tuesday states. But Michael Bloomberg was very different from Sanders in terms of issues, ideology, vibe, background. Sanders often railed against billionaires and their influence, and he still does. And Bloomberg is indeed one of those billionaires. Sanders had either been to the left of the Democratic Party or on the left side of the Democratic Party, depending on how you look at it, for his entire career. And Michael Bloomberg, on the other hand, had been a Republican until shortly before this election. So he had been certainly to the right of the Democratic Party. So there's little chance that Bloomberg's presence hurt Sanders, and all the reason to believe that if Bloomberg wasn't in the race, his voters would go to somebody other than Sanders, probably Biden. So let's take a look at each Super Tuesday state and try to ascertain how each of these candidates did and how things might have played out if either Warren or Bloomberg were not in the race, and how things might have played out if Buttigieg was indeed in the race. So starting with Alabama, Joe Biden is going to get more than 60% of the vote. So there's very little that Sanders can say to maybe, contest that. He's going to struggle in the South this year as he did in 2016, and Biden is going to win a lot of those Southern voters. So a lot of those former Hillary Clinton voters seem to be going towards Sanders, at least based on these Alabama results. Now, America Samoa is going to be a bit of an outlier, as that's going to be the one state that Michael Bloomberg actually wins, and it's going to be Tulsi Gabbard's best showing too, as she's going to get second place, and the only state where she's going to get any delegates. So Sanders is going to come in third, Biden fourth, Warren fifth. Then we see Arkansas. Biden is going to win the state, not get a majority, but a pretty strong plurality, getting almost double what Bernie Sanders is going to get, who comes in second, and Michael Bloomberg is going to come in third. Now, I mentioned Bloomberg and Biden perhaps appealing to some of the same voters. If you combine those numbers, it's going to be a pretty strong majority. Elizabeth Warren, with less support there, she's only going to get 10% of the vote. Now we got California, and that's going to be an interesting state. It's a state that Hillary Clinton actually won in 2016, so Bernie Sanders was unable to win it, but here he does indeed win the state, getting a plurality of the vote there. So that's interesting because, he's able to win with that, and a lot of those voters that voted for him 4 years earlier are going to continue to support him, although it's still going to be a lower percent than what he got in 2016. But because there's so many candidates in the race, he does better here. Now, I will speculate on this. So let's say Pete Buttigieg was still in the race. How would that have affected these numbers? And if we think about California and we think about some of the demographics, I haven't talked too much about one voting block, and that would be the LGBTQ voting block, which is going to be higher in California than it is going to be in most states. Now, I imagine a lot of those folks would have supported Pete Buttigieg, and if he were in the race, he would have gotten a large share of those votes. Now, with him out of the race, did they all go to Biden, as Mark Halperin and others might suggest, or might many of them have gone to Sanders? And what about a lot of those tech bros that were, certainly a large percentage of the Silicon Valley area of California? Now, Bernie Sanders had a strong amount of support amongst those voters, but I imagine a lot of them would have gone to Buttigieg had he been in the race. But with him out of the race, I think some of these voting blocks are going to be more likely to go to Sanders than to Biden. So Sanders is going to win California, despite not necessarily having a strong showing with Hispanics, and that was why he lost to Hillary Clinton, but he is going to show support amongst some of these other voting blocks. Now, Colorado is going to be another state. Sanders is going to win in Colorado, and he's going to get almost a double-digit lead. So that's a state where demographically it's very suited for Sanders, and he's going to win there. And we're going to see Bloomberg come in third, Biden second, Warren, only a 1% behind Bloomberg, and Tulsi Gabbard in fifth place. And we're going to see in Maine. Now, Maine was a state that Sanders won in 2016, but here we see Biden edging out Sanders by 1 percentage point. And maybe this might be a state where Warren's presence maybe hurts Sanders a little bit, because that's a New England state. Warren is from New England, so maybe some of those voters would have gone to Sanders if Warren wasn't there. I'm not really sure. And then Bloomberg coming in fourth there. We're going to see a strong showing by Biden in Massachusetts. It's Elizabeth Warren's home state, but we're going to see actually Biden win it and win it by 6 points. And Sanders is actually going to come in second, Elizabeth Warren coming in third. So a little bit of a disappointing showing for her, but it leads one to wonder now if Elizabeth Warren wasn't in the race, where would those voters have gone? If Michael Bloomberg wasn't in the race, where have those voters had gone? If you combine Warren's vote to Sanders' vote, it is slightly higher than if you combine Biden's votes to Bloomberg's votes. But I don't know if Elizabeth Warren, she seemed to appeal to some middle-aged voters, some seniors. Bernie Sanders really struggled with those older voting blocks. I'm not so sure they would have all gone to Sanders if she were not in the race. I'm sure there was a decent percentage that might have gone to Biden. Now, looking at Minnesota, now that was a state where Sanders had won in 2016, but he fails to win it here. Biden is ahead of Sanders by 9 points. And here, if you combine Biden and Bloomberg's votes, it is higher than if you combine Sanders and Warren's votes. So Biden takes Minnesota, a state Sanders had won 4 years earlier. Now, in North Carolina, we have another southern state and another decisive win as Biden wins there. Sanders continues to struggle in the South, as we saw in 2016 and we see this year. Now, Oklahoma is an interesting state. It was a state Sanders had won in 2016. It's got a very large American Indian voting bloc there, especially in the Democratic Party. And that was one minority group that Sanders did pretty well with. But here we see Joe Biden winning Oklahoma by more than double digits against Sanders. It's a 14-point win. Now, you might think Elizabeth Warren might have a shot at appealing to maybe some of those American Indian voters, as she had some American Indian ancestry that she really played up. Now, if you combine Warren and Sanders's numbers, it's still lower than Joe Biden's numbers. So while maybe there were some American Indians that voted for Warren because of maybe some camaraderie with her and her ancestry, but I don't think it would have been enough had she not been in the race that it would have gone to Sanders instead of Biden. And with Tennessee, we see a pretty decisive win by Biden. And in Texas, actually, Texas is a little bit closer here than it was in 2016. So Sanders has a much better showing here than he did in that earlier year, but Biden still edges out with a small victory there. We're going to see Sanders win in Utah. He tended to do well in those Rocky Mountain states. We see him win in Colorado as well, and we see him winning in Utah here. And it's going to be a pretty strong showing, as he's going to get a double-digit win over Biden with Warren third, Bloomberg fourth. Now, in Vermont, we're going to see Sanders with a decisive win, but with this caveat, he's not going to do as well in his home state as he did in 2016. Biden is actually going to get more votes than Hillary Clinton did. In fact, he's going to get about double the votes that Hillary Clinton had gotten 4 years earlier. So a lot of folks, or at least a fair percentage of them that had voted for Sanders 4 years earlier, are going to probably be voting for Biden here if we look at these numbers in Vermont. So Elizabeth Warren coming in third there, Bloomberg fourth. And then in Virginia, a large southern state, we're going to see Biden get an outright majority and win that with 51% of the vote. So after Super Tuesday, both Warren and Bloomberg are going to drop out, and it's now going to be Biden versus Sanders mano a mano. So we'll have a chance to see without any of the other candidates. We won't have to speculate anymore. We can see who's got more support. Is it going to be Joe Biden or is it going to be Bernie Sanders? So let's take a look at some polling averages. Now, the first one there on the left is from March 2nd. So that's before Super Tuesday and before Warren and Michael Bloomberg drop out. And they're tied, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So they've both got equal numbers of votes. Then we have a week later after Super Tuesday and after the dropouts of Warren and Bloomberg. And Biden's votes go up by a lot, almost double. Sanders' votes go up a little bit as well, but not as much as Biden. So it looks like a lot of Warren's voters went to Biden, and certainly a large number of Bloomberg's voters went to Biden. So for those who maybe argue that Elizabeth Warren's presence in the race really hurt Sanders, if you look at these numbers after her dropping out, Sanders really didn't pick up all that much percentage. He picked up a little bit, but not nearly as much as one might have thought. Now, the other factor here, we see COVID becoming a bigger and bigger issue as we get into this second week of March. It's on the verge. I think maybe one or two states had already closed down by March 9th. But the majority of the country was still open, but the concerns about COVID were certainly looming. And we also see some numbers here from March 15th, so another week later, and we're going to see Biden pick up a little bit there and Bernie Sanders drop a little bit there. So certainly a big bounce. The combination of Super Tuesday, COVID, and the dropouts of Warren and Bloomberg all seem to help Biden and seem to hurt Sanders. So the idea that things were kind of unfair to Sanders, well, in this mano a mano period of the race, there's no excuses. You'd want to see better numbers than what Sanders is showing here. Now we're going to see some more primaries on March 10th. Now, the country has not shut down yet, although it's getting pretty close to the point where it is going to shut down. I think some states were maybe shut down by March 10th, but the overwhelming majority were still open, and we're going to have 6 contests here. And it's a pretty good cross-section of the country here. We got different geographic areas, some smaller states, some medium-sized states as well, some what we might call battleground states. And what's interesting, too, if if you want to be fair to Sanders, you want to see states where he's particularly strong in, not necessarily 6 states where he's weak in. And of these 6 states, if you look at 2016, he had won 4 of these 6 states. The 5th one, Missouri, he came very close. He only lost it by 1 or 2%. There was only one of these states, Mississippi, that he lost decisively in 2016. But these are states that should be a good opportunity for Sanders to maybe turn things around. It's mano a mano. He doesn't have any of the other candidates to be a distraction. He has a chance to really close the deal in states that maybe could be favorable to him. So let's look at Idaho, another one of these Rocky Mountain Western states. He tends to do well there. We see him win Colorado and Utah, but here in Idaho at this stage, he does not win. Biden wins it by 7 points, so a fairly close race, but Biden edges out, and at this stage of the race, it seems like he's picking up a lot of support that had gone to Sanders in the past, but now it's going to Biden. And we see Michigan, another state that Sanders had won in 2016, but he does not win it here, as it's a one-on-one between him and Biden. It looks like Biden was able to pick up a lot of Hillary Clinton's votes, but he also picked up some of Sanders' votes as he managed to win here in 2020, beating Sanders by about 7 points. Now, Mississippi is the one state where it was a blowout in 2016, and it's a blowout here as well, as we see Biden with a very decisive win in Mississippi. Now, Missouri was the state that Sanders narrowly lost to Clinton in 2016, but it's not narrow here. Biden gets a 25-point win. So, we saw Missouri close in 2008 as well. So it had a history of being kind of close, but it's not close here. It's something of a blowout. Now, the one state out of this 6 that Sanders seems to win is North Dakota. So he gets a pretty impressive win there, but it's probably the state on the list with the least number of delegates, as it's the smallest state. Sanders does a little bit better in those smaller states, some of those states with a larger, frankly, white population, although North Dakota, I guess, has an American Indian population as well, and he does well with those voters. So demographically, I guess it was kind of suited for him. So he gets that 13-point win, which is impressive, but in the context of him losing these 5 other states, not so impressive. Now, Washington State, a very close state there, and one where you think Sanders might have a shot. He tended to do very well in the Pacific Northwest in 2016. Now, if you look at the totals here, obviously both got less than 40% of the vote. I imagine there might have been a fair amount of early voting in Washington, but we see Biden edging out with a small victory in a state where you think Sanders would have a shot. He definitely won it, and he won it pretty decisively in 2016, but he loses it here. Sanders will soldier on for a few more weeks after that and make his last stand in Wisconsin, another state that he won in 2016. But here he loses it, and he loses it almost 2-1 on April 7th as Joe Biden manages to win over not only the folks who had voted for Hillary Clinton 4 years earlier, but many of the people that probably voted for Sanders as well. So we see a turnaround, a state where Sanders had beaten Hillary Clinton, but here he loses rather decisively to Joe Biden. I never really liked the expression that a certain candidate is taking votes away from another candidate. You know, candidates have the right to put their name out and give voters a choice, and voters have the right to make whatever choice they make. As Sanders' name was on the ballot, if voters wanted to vote for him, they could have, but not enough of them did, and that was the reason for him not getting the Democratic nomination in 2020 as well as 2016. Now, voters certainly had the opportunity, and you can look at the timing of when Pete Buttigieg dropped out, Amy Klobuchar dropped out, maybe Elizabeth Warren didn't drop out, and kind of feel like, okay, maybe those factors could have affected the dynamics of the race. But I really think as you kind of crunch the numbers, I don't really think those decisions affected it all that much. And I think that that period of time where it was one-on-one and you saw Biden winning those states that Bernie Sanders had won before, it just looked like Biden just had more support. If you look at the polling numbers in the polls, yes, there was a period of time in February where Sanders had the polling lead, but if you look at December, January, if we went back further, if we looked at October, November, Biden had the lead for most of that time, and he got the lead back in March again. So maybe you could make the case that we ought to have ranked choice voting or runoffs or some other way so that these things are not controversial. But I think even if we had that, I think that the evidence shows that Biden probably would have won anyway. And like I said, I think that that stage of the race where it was one-on-one really kind of decisively kind of showed that. Now, again, if you are a Bernie Sanders supporter, you can certainly argue that the voters ought to have voted for him, and that's a legitimate case to be made. But I don't think you can really say that he was cheated out of the race. The fact of the matter is, voters had the chance to vote for him. His name was on the ballot, and just not enough of them voted for him, and that's why he didn't get the nomination. And the same thing could be said, I think, of 2016 as well. But I certainly would welcome people with different points of view to certainly express that. Certainly put some comments down. If you appreciated this video, you can hit the like button, you can subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.